Yes, welcome to the second talk of today's colloquium. The talk, as before, is about 40 minutes, including Q&A. And if you have a question, please send your name and affiliation to me. And we will record we already started. So please turn off your camera and mute your microphone. So I'm happy to introduce the second speaker, Adam Chong, lecturer or assistant professor in the US system in linguistics at Queen Mary University of London. Adam received his PhD from UCLA in 2017, and his research interests are diverse, including but not limited to phonological acquisition and processing, phonological variation, phonology, morphology, interface and learning, prosody and intonation phonology, speech perception, quantitative and computational methods, etc. In fact, Adam gave a talk in another series as well, so it's good to have you back at ICU-LINC series today. So we will hear his talk about Singapore English intonation on autosegmental metrical perspective.
Thanks, Seunghun. Let me just move over to sharing. Yeah. Okay. Great. Just to check that the screen is showing now, hopefully.
Yes, you can see. Yeah.
Great. So thanks so much for that introduction, Seunghun. And again, it's really nice to be here and within, I guess, a month. And so today I'm going to be talking to you about a lot of work in progress from a project that I've been working on for a while now on the Singapore English intonation, in particular, looking at this from a phonological perspective. And I should say at the outset that in fact, all of this work is in collaboration with James Neate German, who is at Aix-Marseille at the Laboratoire Parole et Langage, and has received various bits of funding here and there from various organizations. So just to dive in, just to give a bit of background about Singapore, if you're not familiar with the place. So Singapore is this tiny island at the bottom of the Millennium Peninsula in Southeast Asia. It's a former British Crown colony. And historically, it was an important trading post between Europe and Southeast Asia. Importantly, I guess, from the perspective of the development of the local variety, there were high levels of historical immigration from southern India and southern China, particularly, and it continues to have high levels of immigration to this day, in particular from the West, at least in terms of the expatriate community. The current ethnic makeup of Singapore, at least for, I guess if you want to consider these as residents or citizens, is predominantly Chinese, so ethnically Chinese, like myself. These make up about 3/4 of the population, and the rest are made up roughly from a 2-to-1 ratio of Malays and Indians, right? So there's sort of an ethnically diverse set of population. Linguistically, Singapore has, technically speaking, 4 official languages. So English, Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil. English is the primary language used in government. And similarly, English is the main medium of instruction in school. So most classes and subjects are taught in English. The other languages, so Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil, and potentially some other ones beyond this set, are taught in schools, but these are taught as mother tongues, or they're taught as language classes. But who learns what is based almost, for the most part, entirely on the ethnicity of the person. So an ethnic Chinese person like myself would have learned Mandarin growing up. So in principle, then, most of the population is bilingual to some extent. Although we do see some differences in home use of English and the other language varieties, depending on ethnic background, but also in some ways mediated by education. And here's a brief snapshot of some subset of census data from 2010, just to give you a sense of the differences across the population. Notably that within the Chinese population as well, although there's a rough split once you take it as a whole, between home use of English and Mandarin, once you look at the educated Chinese population, the university-educated Chinese population, that is, English is sort of just by a smidgen the majority home language used. So before we sort of dive into the actual main bits of today's talk, I kind of wanted to start by just making a disclaimer about what variety or varieties of Singapore English that we're actually going to be examining today. So if you're familiar at all with the literature on this, the question of how to characterize the linguistic or English variety of varieties in Singapore is an open one. And it's also one that has had, there are a number of different models. Most of them share in common sort of at least two endpoints on some kind of scale. So at one hand, you have colloquial Singapore English, which many people know as Singlish, which has received a lot of attention just generally. And on the other hand, we can have on the sort of more acrolectal end, something that we might call standard Singapore English. So models of this kind of variation have either looked at this from the perspective of dialect continuum, such that there is just a client of features that go from one to the other, or potentially a diglossic situation where you have a standard variety versus a colloquial variety. It doesn't really matter from our perspective for today whatever kind of model you take. The most important thing to note is that given that the kind of way that we're getting our data or looking at the kinds of participants in our studies, what we're really going to be looking at primarily is going to be something along the lines of a standard Singapore English variety, right? To the extent that there is something like that. So previously, there have been a lot of phonological descriptions or sort of phonological studies on Singapore English. In the early descriptions, whether this is actually true or not, it was suggested that standard Singapore English approximated some kind of British received pronunciation. And I'm not necessarily sure that this was exactly the case, but whatever that was, there's clearly, I think, a consensus now that there's an emergence of a new stabilized norm that is quite different, as we shall see, from Western varieties, right? And so Singapore English then is one of these new English varieties that, at least within the world English literature, this is a term you might see. Segmentally, there are a number of features that people have examined that distinguish Singapore English from British English or other Western varieties. In particular, it's been reported that Singapore English has less vowel reduction than British or American English. So this has impact for, say, questions about previous studies on rhythmic timing. Sort of fairly common cross-linguistically sort of substitutions of theta for F or T, and depending on position, as well as some vowel mergers between especially the tense and lax series. What we're going to be talking about today, and especially given that this is a prosody series, we're going to be looking at Singapore English prosody, in particular intonation, which I probably don't need to sort of define this, but broadly speaking is the rhythm and the melody of sentences. And this is a relatively underexamined aspect of Singapore English phonology and phonetics. And so the goals for my talk today are, so I should say this is sort of a really initial part of a longer project. So some of these results are quite in its initial stages, right? So we're going to be looking at Singapore English intonation from a phonological perspective, so primarily an autosegmental metrical approach. And what I'm going to do then is provide quantitative evidence in support of various aspects of the model. But from a kind of more big picture perspective, I think what I'd like to sort of end with then is to sort of use this as an illustration of how this approach might help us understand sort of the questions of prominence and rhythm that sort of have dogged previous work on Singapore English, and potentially allow us to think about how this kind of approach might actually allow us to examine other varieties of New Englishes. And just generally sort of using this as a case study of how the study of New English varieties, especially ones in high context situations, right, allows us to potentially expand our understanding of intonational typology. So let's dive into some data. So this is just a global intonation pattern of a standard declarative sentence in Singapore English. I hope the sound plays. So this is a sentence: Millennium was an old hotel chain. Let's just see.
Millennium was an old hotel chain.
I'm just going to play it again.
Millennium was an old hotel chain.
Hopefully people can hear this. If not, I can just pronounce it again. So what you probably get here is that a typical declarative sentence in Singapore English consists of a series of rises that with each observer rise usually encompassing a single content word and or preceding function words. So you kind of have this parsing of a larger unit into these smaller F0 sort of rises that really do correspond to content words. I should note that this has previously been, the intonation of Singapore English has previously been described as sustained level steps. That's, I think, at least from this initial set of data, clearly not the case. What's also of note, just because of to motivate at least part of the analysis, or part of the methodology that we're going to be using later on, is that the first rise, so on the initial content word, tends to be the largest in pitch range, and every subsequent rise after that is in a compressed range. And this is something we see across, this is a really consistent effect that we see across speakers. Right? So just to give you a quick comparison of the differences between Singapore English and, say, a non-Singapore English production. So in this case, what you see on the right is the same sentence produced by me in a non-Singapore English production. So what the main differences that we're going to be focusing on here are the fact that the peak alignment is quite different. In particular, in where we expected in, say, British or American English to align to what's putatively a stressed syllable, so Millennium. In Singapore English, the peak is reliably at the end of a word. Right? So the question then is sort of whether this is arising from some kind of lexical prominence or not. There are other aspects of this of contours as well that are quite different, but they all sort of fall out from a similar underlying phonological assumption that we will sort of dive into. What has been done in Singapore English prosody? There's been quite a bit of work on stress or lexical prominence within Singapore English, but this is quite a thorny area, and hopefully I think the results that we will show today help us shed light as to why this might be the case, or at least why it's a bit of a murky area. Some studies assume a British English stress system. Actually, we will be assuming that today, at least for purposes of our production study. But some intonational models, notably by Chow 2016, eschew the notion of stress completely. Right? So in that model, Singapore English basically does not have lexical stress. And this is complicated by the fact that the cues for at least purported lexical stress or lexical prominence are a little messy. So for one, they're not cued. It's been reported that lexical stress in Singapore English is not cued by high pitch, or does not correlate with high F0. Intensity and, to a lesser extent, duration seem to be more important cues. And from the perception perspective, it's often been reported that the final syllable of a word is the one that is perceived to be prominent. Right? So the area of lexical prosody then is a bit murky. As far as when we think about things from the kind of more sentence level, though, the most of the work that's been done on Singapore English and sort of sentence level intonation has been actually to do with rhythm. So the most well-known result is that Singapore English rhythm is argued to be syllable timed. That is to say, versus British and American English, where it's stress timed. And this arises primarily through the use of an examination through the use of rhythmic metrics. So these are like pairwise variability indices. Although, as Varieties points out, these metrics are somewhat problematic for a number of reasons. Primarily, at least for our purposes here today, these metrics rely on a fairly low-level phonetic detail that overlooks potentially their important role that phonologically driven variation might play. In particular, given that these variability indices primarily deal with durational variation, what these indices ignore is the possibility that durational variation can arise from a number of different sources. Primarily both lexical prominence, a little stress, as well as phrasal phonology. Right? And it also ignores the role of other aspects of the signal that can contribute to rhythmic perception. So what part of the issue is really that we don't really understand, but just based on these rhythm metrics, sort of what the phonological system is. Previous work on intonation itself has not really investigated a prosodic or phonological structure per se. Most of the work in this area has primarily examined tunes or contours at a phonetic level. But what has been argued or observed is that people have had difficulty in identifying single prominent syllables or a word within a phrase. Right? So the idea of prominence, coming back to this lexical prosody issue, seems to be at play as well. So the approach that I'm going to be taking today is then to look at Singapore English prosody or intonation within an AM framework, so within a phonological approach. And what we're going to be doing then is to accrue evidence for various aspects of the prosodic structure or the proposed prosodic structure, and then consider how these various sources of prosodic variability might shed light on the previous difficulties in prominence detection and rhythmic classification. And then we'll sort of end by considering how Singapore English fits within potentially the broader intonational typology. I probably won't need to spend too much time on this, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the approach I'm going to be taking is the autosegmental metrical approach, or AM. And so within this phonological approach, tune and text are independent of each other. Tunes are composed primarily of high and low abstract tonal categories. And tones or tunes can mark both prominence relationships between words, say through pitch accents, and or prosodic structure and phrasing through boundary tones. And it's important to note here that tones in the observable F0, so the actual phonetic implementation, are distinct levels, right? And most syllables are actually underspecified for tone. And this kind of approach allows us to capture the fact that what might seem to be phonetically different contours actually, for example, derived from the same underlying abstract structure, right? So this is a classic incredulity contour, and we've already seen examples of this in Nicole's talk with rhetorical questions and information seeking questions. What's important, I think, by adopting such an approach, I think what's really helpful is that it allows us to think about how Singapore English fits in with intonational typology. Because the AM approach has been applied to a typologically diverse set of languages. And what we've seen is that languages can mark prominence through F0 on either heads or phrases. So this is a pitch accents and lexically stressed syllables. So this is a head prominence type language, versus phrase edges. So this are edge prominence type languages, or both. And importantly, I think for us today is that some languages only mark phrase edges. That is to say, F0 isn't used to mark stress or pitch accents, right? Presumably in these cases, at least in these cases, because stress or pitch accents don't exist, right? So diving into Singapore English. So in sort of the early part of the decade, I proposed a model of a phonological model of Singapore English intonation that was mostly, that argued that F0 in Singapore English was primarily phrase-based, that is to say, edge marking. And the main sort of departure from, say, a inner circle or Western variety of English was the positing of this level of phrasal structure called the accentral phrase. So which consists of a single content word as well as possibly preceding function words. So this type of structure corresponds to similar kinds of structures of similar size that have been posited for other languages like Korean, French, and Japanese. So it's within this accentral phrase then that we find this low-high, the domain of the low-high contours, with the H tone really seen as a delimitive tone realized in the final syllable. The L tone is a bit more complicated, as you shall see, and at least in the initial model, I posited an L star pitch accent, that is to say, F0 marked on a lexically prominent syllable. And so these details about the L itself are really something that we won't really be able to answer definitively today, but I will show you some data that kind of gets at what the issues are. So within this model, then what we have is, going back to the initial sentence, we have 4 accentral phrases, each marked with a low-high contour. Some differences obviously occur in the final case. Feel free to ask me more about this later. So what we're going to do today then is look at possible different sources of prominence. So within the sort of initial model, what we find is that, at least in Singapore English, we would expect possible sources of prominence to arise from lexical prominence, so potentially stress positions. And again, I'm just going to sort of highlight this as a potentially murky issue, as well as phrasal prominence, and in particular, the accentral phrase, as well as potentially higher levels. So in the series of sort of studies I'm going to be going through or walking through in the next sort of 20 minutes or so, we're going to be asking different questions about different sources of prominence. So that is to say, are there durational correlates of the accentral phrase, and whether or not we find lexical marking or stress within these accentral phrases through the use of F0 or potentially other cues, and what those might look like, as well as to consider very briefly the relationship between F0 and stress and by phrasal position, whether or not we see consistent alignment of these things once you actually look at the sentence level on a broader scale. So in this data set comes from 2 production studies. These are from a while ago now, from 2014 and 16. These were both recorded in Singapore at Nanyang Technological University. We're going to be primarily focusing on the first of these, so the 2014 set with 26 Chinese participants. These are all university-age students, so between 20 and 28. And speakers in these contexts were instructed to read each sentence aloud in a conversational manner. And so I should say that these are all lab speech, so it's likely more, as I said, likely to be a more standard variety. Okay, so let's dive in. I should report then firstly the demographic backgrounds of the speakers in our data set. So most of them, despite the fact that, as we saw previously in the context, although sort of we saw it actually in the initial statistics or census that the sort of rough split between English and Mandarin use within this population should be about 50-50. What we found was actually that most of our speakers in this case reported English as a first language, at least in the language background questionnaire, with the other 3 reporting, not surprisingly, Mandarin as a first language, right? But in both cases, both sort of everyone reported both languages being used or learned at home as well as in school. Right, so for the most part, people are showing a very similar kind of language background. And it's also important to note here that we're controlling as much as possible for education levels. So we have here most of them being university students, university educated students, all but 3. Right, so here we're really controlling for ethnicity as well as education background, primarily because there's been a lot of reported variability and just impressionistically a lot of variability in the population. And for our purposes, no one has reported spending any substantial amount of time outside of Singapore, right? So we're looking really here at a very controlled initial population set, and one that allows us to potentially make an initial model, but then allows us to potentially later on extrapolate from this to see how or in what ways other aspects of the population might actually, how they differ. Right? So in the first study, then we're going to be looking at looking at evidence for the accentual phrase. So are there correlates by way of pre-boundary lengthening that tells us something about, that potentially gives us evidence for this level of structure, right? And particularly, we find evidence for pre-boundary lengthening that is intermediate between the highest level of prosodic structure, so the intonational phrase, as well as the lowest level one, so that is to say the word. So what we did was we placed prepositions and auxiliary verbs in one of the 3 sentential positions, so word final, AP final, as well as IP final. And we achieved this by using ellipsis for auxiliary verbs and stranding in preposition, the case of prepositions. So just an example here, but using the ellipsis constructions for verbs, the auxiliary verbs. We had cases like, so the target word in this case is will. So we have he said he will, and this is an IP final position. The bracketing here just indicates sort of what we think the parsing strategy is, versus he said he will tomorrow. So will here is an AP final position. So by putting the adverb in that position there, we were able to sort of get it at an AP final position within a larger IP. And then in the basic sentence, so he said he will go tomorrow, where now the target word will, the auxiliary verb is in word final IP medial position. Right? So in this way, we're able to get the same target word, but across different phrasal contexts. And here we're going to just be presenting data from the vowel duration on target words as a function of phrasal position. So what do we find? What we find is that if we look at duration across these 3 contexts, what we find is a fairly strong effect of what we might have expected. So in the IP final position, vowels are the longest. In the word final position, the vowels are the shortest. And in the AP final position, these are somewhat in between. So as we kind of, in support of the model, what we find is that duration increases as the size of the prosodic boundary increases, right? Prosodic boundary within the hierarchy, prosodic hierarchy increases. So this is sort of similar to the kinds of pre-boundary lengthening effects that we've seen in other varieties of English, as well as other languages more generally. as stated by Whiteman et al. So what we find here then is evidence of phrasal lengthening that's commiserate with, that's giving evidence for some kind of intermediary kind of boundary. We can also then just confirm our intuitions here by looking at what's going on with F0. So given that the initial observation was that phrase final syllables also have higher F0, we wanted to just double check here that this was exactly the case. And this is, what we found was as we expected. So in phrase final position, AP final syllables have significantly higher F0 than in word final position, right? We should note here that IP final syllables here were not analyzed since they're final boundary tones that kind of muddy the water. Right? And these two cues together through a linear discriminant analysis allow us to really nicely separate out both the word and AP levels, right? Both F0 alone and duration alone do get us sort of a high degree of separation of these categories, but accuracy in terms of the discriminant analysis is significantly improved by inclusion of both factors. Suggesting again that essentially that the level of the AP, right, is something that seems to be is support. So what we find then, just to kind of briefly discuss this and take stock of what we've seen, is we found then evidence of pre-boundary lengthening that is intermediate between a word and IP levels. So this we're going to call this the essential phrase, and both duration and F0 distinguish word and AP levels. AP final syllables are longer and have higher F0 than word final syllables. Right, so this provides us initial support for the prosodic structure, at least if the levels of prosodic structure within the initial model. And so given that, what we were interested to then examine was, well, given that we have this evidence for some kind of prosodic structure, what are its internal characteristics? And in particular, we were interested to examine the potential interplay between lexical stress and phrasal prominence. Given the fact that F0 has been argued to not be really a crucial cue for stress, where intensity and duration seem to be more important, and that some previous models have eschewed stress completely, right? And also the fact that at a sentence level, it's been often hard to identify a single prominent word. So the fact is that there's a lot going on here. We're trying to see essentially if we can, by looking more closely at this AP structure, whether some of these murkiness can be unpicked. Before going into this though, I'd like to just point out that we're actually going to be testing in particular as well one specific, I guess, phonological model of or say tone or tone association in Singapore English. It's been argued by a number of authors, so Ng and Lim in particular, that Singapore English is a tone language to some degree. That is to say that there is a correlation or a tone, stress to tone correlation where stress syllables within a prosodic word are assigned a mid-tone. And this, I should say from the outset, this is primarily referring to colloquial Singapore English, but there's no reason to believe, at least a priori, that these should be any different. So Ng has posited this sort of stress to tone assignment algorithm where final syllables under her model were assigned a high tone, the first stress syllable was assigned a mid-tone, and any pre-stressed syllable was assigned a low tone. And so then you get interpolation under this model between, or M-tones specified for syllables between the stress and final syllable. The crucial thing here is that we get these these purportedly minimal triplet sets of low, low, high, mid, high, and high, high, as you can see here on the left, right, depending on the stress of the initial syllable. So a couple of things to note here that under this model, every single syllable is defined for tone, and that it also makes actually a very important prediction as to how we might expect to see tone assignment or F0 aligned to stress syllables, right? So this is sort of where we started off, or the prediction, one of the models we're going to be testing. And so in this study, we're going to be looking at whether or not we find evidence of lexical stress marking by F0, and potentially in the way that we expect given Ng's model, using the same set of participants as in study 1. So what we did here was we placed 1, 2, 3, and 4 syllable words as well as phrases in sentence initial position. And the reason we looked at sentence initial position only was because of the largest pitch range that this possesses, right? So the idea was if we're going to find any differences, we should find them in the context where we see the largest possible room for maneuvering. We're going to be presenting primarily quantitative and statistical analyses of 2 and 3 syllable target words, so single word cases, where we have varied the underlying stress based on the British English system between the initial and second syllable. So we're going to be looking at cases like Emily versus Millennium. And we're going to be presenting data that measures F0 and plotting it by word type, so whether it's stress or initial or final, by syllable number, right? So to kind of give you a sense of just a broad contour. So just to kind of think about what the predictions are under the existing phonological model of tone stress association, under this model, the main difference should really emerge on the first syllable, right? Since under her model, the main differences here are between whether or not the initial syllable has assigned a mid-tone if it's stress versus a low tone if it's medial stress, right? So the predictive schema that we're going to be looking for is whether we see an initial stress pattern like this and a medial stress pattern like that, where the main differences should really emerge in the initial syllable. And further, we expect to see level tones across each syllable, and therefore the differences should be just observable by just from means, right? So no, we don't really need to refer to dynamic measures. Right? Okay, so what do we find? I'm going to show you first data by for 2 syllable targets, followed by data of 3 syllable targets. So when we look at 2 syllable targets, so these again are single word phrases with 2 syllables differing by stress position. What we find is that overall, so this is the red line, this is just mean F0 by syllable number. Overall, stress initial words, so the red line, have overall higher F0 than stress final words, which is the blue line. Right? So the red line is just higher than the blue line, right? And the final syllable, not surprisingly, as you might expect, has a higher F0 than the initial one due to the final high tone that we've seen already. But crucially, we don't actually find an interaction in the way that we would expect it under Ng's model, because under her model, we should only find a difference in F0 in the initial syllable and nothing on the final syllable here. And so we don't really see then a difference as we expect. Now, you might say then, well, maybe this is just to do with the 2 syllable cases. Let's look at 3 syllable cases. So in 3 syllable targets, what we find is basically the same thing. So once we look at stress syllables, stress initial words, again, the red line, we find that these have overall higher F0 than stress medial words, right? That is to say, the blue line here. We find that there is a difference in syllable number. Again, this is just as we predict, given what we already know and have seen. So the final syllable has the highest F0. This is higher than the medial, which is in turn higher than the initial syllable. But crucially, again, we don't get an interaction. That is to say, F0 is just overall higher across the entire target, but not just on the initial syllable, as we would have expected under Ng's model. I'd also like to note here just the fact that there are the sort of magnitude of the differences between both of these conditions is not huge, right? It's something I can come back to at the end. So we've seen sort of the targeted analysis of stress and F0 marking. What we wanted to then also do is then look at the other kinds of target types that varied by the number of syllables, of stress position, as well as the makeup of content versus function words. Because under Ng's model, that's really tied to, we should not expect to see similar contours across these different kinds of items, right? And so what we have here are just time normalized F0 plots. These are not across different item types by number of syllables, so from 1 to 4 syllable items, different stress positions, as well as differences with makeup of, either whether it's a single contour word or a function plus contour word, right? And what we notice here is that, broadly speaking, the general contour shape of these different targets is similar, right? So we just see a similar rising pattern, right? Regardless of the kind of internal constituency, as you might say, right, of these examples, of these targets, right? You might note that there could be potentially some alignment differences, right? But these are something we're not going to sort of really discuss today. It's something that we're going to be thinking about for future work. Right? So to just take stock of things now, what we find is that there's no clear evidence to support Ng's claim about tone and stress association, right? That we expected to find this particular pattern of results, but instead we find what can essentially be thought of as parallel lines. right? Each word or AP seems to be characterized by a similar rising contour regardless of size and constituency. And overall, F0 is raised over the entire word or phrase when stress is initial, although the size, as I said, in F0 is quite small. So we're not really seeing very crucial F0 marking of stress, at least not in the sense of potentially a tonal target. One question is that whether we see sort of other correlates of stress by way of duration and intensity. And here we're just going to present these results fairly quickly, just to give you an idea as to how these might contribute to sort of stress marking. So just looking at intensity first. What we notice here, this is 2-syllable words on the left-hand side, 3-syllable words on the right-hand side. What we notice is that the main differences are in fact actually deriving, sort of seem to be localized in the first syllable. And here is which is where we might expect it to be. So stress syllables, or stress initial target words have a higher intensity on the first syllable than stress medial cases. But we also note is that phrase finally, or word, sort of the final syllable, is also associated with a high intensity, and this is the case in both contexts, right? So it seems to be that not only is stress potentially being cued by intensity, higher intensity, but phrase finality it might also be cued by intensity, a higher intensity as well, right? So if we look at duration, what we find is that, so this is duration by the same sort of plot here. What we find is that word final syllables on the most part, there's one exception in this plot, are marked by a higher sort of longer duration. And this is not surprising given we actually expect this given the phrasal model, right? But we do see some evidence for stressed syllables having a longer duration than unstressed syllables within a word, right? So if you think about just say the blue line on the right, the stressed syllable in the medial case is longer than the unstressed case. Right? But clearly the differences in this within these are kind of potentially minor in some cases, right? So if you think about the differences between the first and second syllable in the red lines, right? So these are the stress initial cases. There's something odd going on with stress initial disyllabic words where we don't see as much lengthening on the final syllable. I'm happy to chat more about that in the question period. So what we find here then is that initial APs don't show a clear evidence for a tonal target in a lexically prominent syllable. That is to say, we don't really see this M-tone target that's been previously posited. And overall, F0 trajectory really looks similar despite the stress pattern as well as the number of words. What we do find, though, is possible support for certain syllables bearing prominence within a word at a lexical level. So there seems to be some kind of lexical prominence marking through the use of other acoustic measures, such as duration and intensity. And what I haven't shown you today, but feel free to do ask me about this later on, is we've also found possible evidence for word boundary marking at the left edge with pitch or with duration and intensity, which we haven't actually seen these results in what I showed you before. And we find final, again, support just from the baseline model of the fact that AP final syllables have longer durations and higher F0. Right? So this is just further support of what we've seen. In the interest of time, I'm just going to really quickly mention one little pickle, which is to do with the AP initial L, which I've sort of blissfully ignored until now. We've focused primarily on the right edge of the word, but we've also have some data looking at the alignment of this AP initial L in various other contexts. So especially whether or not this is always aligned with some kind of stressed syllable or not. The long and short of it is that when we look at non-initial phrases, we find that the alignment of the initial L is variable. So you do find putative alignment to stressed syllables as well as to the left wedge of the AP, but not in a stressed syllable. So we see some differences in alignment there, as well as differences in general tonal shape. So there's not the last word on the alignment of the kind of initial, the left edge of the AP. Feel free to ask me more about this in the question period. So just sort of zooming out then to see what this tells us. So what the quantitative investigations have then shed light on is the various sources of prominence in Singapore English. So what we found then is support for aspects of this model, in particular evidence for the central phrase. Although the status, as I said, of the low star or the initial L boundary marking is less clear. What we find is that F0 does not mark stress, certainly not straightforwardly, but we do find evidence of zero marking or stress marking using duration and intensity, right? And in non-intentional phrases, we find that this isn't always the case either. We have values that sometimes align with stress syllables, but sometimes not. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this slide, but we can come back to this later on. I just want to talk about what the implications are for this study sort of more generally. So I want to think about what our results say about rhythm in Singapore English, bearing in mind again that previous work has suggested that rhythm in Singapore English is syllable timed, right, using metrics. And as I said, these are somewhat unreliable predictors to the extent that they only describe superficial variation. And Varieties in particular has argued for thinking more about understanding the underlying phonological system to then allowing us a better way of understanding the purported rhythmic differences. So let's consider how this might look given what we've found. If we think about rhythmic distinctions arising from, say, phonological structure, then for British English, the relevant positions are going to be syllables that are lexically marked for stress, including both primary and secondary stress, the subset of lexically stressed syllables that also bear pitch accents, as well as syllables near intermediate phrase boundary. So there's sort of 3 or 4 potentially possible contributors to sort of rhythmic structure in terms of durational variability. But when we think about Singapore English instead, regarding the most prominent syllables, we find that the relevant positions are primarily syllables occurring at the right edge of the AP. So this is, say, coinciding with the content word boundary, with possibly the weaker role of lexically determined stress. Right? That is to say, the number of relevant positions that sort of might be the source of prosodic variability are fewer in Singapore English than there are with, say, a language of British English. And it could also be argued that Singapore English has a greater or higher macro rhythm compared to British or American English, just due to the greater frequency of tonal alternations, just because of the density of APs within an intonational phrase. And this itself can give rise to purported rhythmic grouping, right? Because we know that F0 alternations, or at least perceived rhythm, is not solely a function of durational segmental timing. We know that tonal alternations then can contribute significantly to the perceptive rhythm, right? And so the argument here is then Singapore English might sort of purported alternation or sort of rhythm characteristics of Singapore English might fall out from a consideration of the tonal alternations as well. So thinking about this, so in terms of that sort of the results or implications for rhythm, but thinking about zooming out even further to think about Singapore English in the context of intonational typology, what we've seen so far is that Singapore English doesn't really show clear or consistent stress marking with F0, but yet there is some evidence, and I say some because I think the jury's still out on this, for lexical stress marking being marked with other cues. So if this is, further work sort of sustains this hypothesis, or this observation rather, then this actually puts Singapore English in a typologically interesting and potentially rare class of languages that do have lexical stress, but where intonation is exclusively used for marking or phrase edges. So the number of languages that have been argued to be, that fall into this category are somewhat limited. So Kuwait by Rimson and Uyghur recently by Major and Mayer. Right. So I think what's great about this is then the thinking about how adopting a phonological approach allows us to think about how the different, we can think about having a different structural sources of variability that then allows us to tie in to existing intonational typology. Right. And so I think that what's also useful to think about is how examinations of new Englishes like Singapore English might also give us a bit broader understanding of intonational typology, because most of these new English varieties sort of emerged through highly multilingual as well as high context situations. So just to close with a few open questions and sort of potentially head off, or at least sort of predict some questions that people might already have. So one thing that we haven't obviously reported on is perception, right? So sort of question of stress and stress by stress perception, and whether or not these cues are reliable as they are, and especially whether these cues are reliable across different phrasal positions, right? And how whether listeners actually distinguish words with different stress patterns and whether they can reliably do so, right? So this is a big piece of the puzzle that we're going to try and examine in future work. More broadly, something that I'm particularly interested in, since due to my interest in phonological acquisition, is the question of how this kind of model system can be acquired given the variability in the actual linguistic landscape. That is to say, what is actually in the input, and how much of this adult system is actually influenced by, say, inner circle Englishes. That is to say, sort of languages like varieties like British or American English. And relatedly to this, what are the details of sociolectal variation with regards to intonation? Since we know that, at least it's been reported, that Singapore English listeners seem to be able to correctly identify the ethnicity of speakers. How does this fall out from a model that we have? And we'll just say that I think having a phonological model to begin with allows us to then actually tease out what aspects of variation are phonological versus phonetic, right? So just to give you some work by Cambridge PhD student Jasper Sim, who's looking at least part of his dissertation on acquisition of intonation in Singapore. So what we have here are productions across a simple sentence by children of different language backgrounds. The red ones being ethnically Chinese backgrounds, and the blue and green ones ethnically Malay backgrounds. And so I think what having a phonological approach allows us to think about is how to interpret these kinds of differences, right? Whether or not, and what this tells us, at least given what we've seen, is that what we're seeing in these children are similar potential phonological targets, that is to say a low-high pattern, but with different phonetic implementations to do with scaling, right? That might be the source of the sociolectal variation. So just to conclude, we've provided today some evidence for prosodic structure within Singapore English, and has shown how a phonological approach allows us to explain some previous findings, and shown how the contribution of new linkages to intonational typology. Right now, we're sort of examining the questions of stress perception and focus correlates, and hoping to also tackle variation and head on with a very large sample size. Since I think, at least in varieties like these, the question of variation is something that we can't really hide away from. So before I end, I just want to thank, sort of do a final acknowledgement of the number of people who have been involved in this project, as well as finally thank you for your time. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, so if you have any question or comments or any clarification, you may send me a message and we will call you. So we don't have any right now. so let me. So this is just a clarification question. Maybe you mentioned it and I just like listen over it or something like that. What was Ng's like study based on? Like, so in your case, you recorded many different studies on the condition. I think it's her dissertation, right? Dissertation.
Yeah, it was part of a dissertation. So there were not a lot of speakers. I think there were probably 4 or 5, but it was not particularly acoustically examined, at least not in a way that I could see. And so the data was primarily, similar type of thing, was target words in particular positions, but it was a bit. There was no real, actually, I think, acoustic examination to kind of show these differences. At least not that I could quite tell. And in some ways, one of the things that was interesting, well, not interesting, but like I think problematic, is sort of the circularity of the way that she argues about this, where it's sort of we expect stress to have a midtone, therefore we're going to look for midtones for stress, right? So that this idea as well, and I think the crucial thing, I'm just going to go back to this slide here. I think the other thing that we sort of need to consider is whether or not the F0 differences that we actually see are actually a phonological contrast or some byproduct of some kind of other thing, right? Because the differences we actually see across the conditions are quite small. I mean, they're all within 10 hertz, right? If you look at across conditions and by participants. And so it's not really clear to me that you could even maintain a contrast of that type once you think about this intentional context, where we know the J&D's just noticeable differences have to be much higher, right? And there's also a lot of individual speaker variability. That is to say, some speakers show basically the same pattern for both types of words. Some people show a slightly bigger differentiation. So we think that the purported differences might just be a byproduct of higher intensity, or possibly, I should say, right, higher intensity, to the extent that intensity is closely correlated with F0. Right, so that kind of, if you think about like, oh, and if we have higher intensity for a syllable, that's kind of just raises the pitch level for the entire rest of the unit, right? But we kind of need to sort of test. I think we can test this quite clearly in a kind of perceptual experiment.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the clarification. We have some question that came in. Katrina Lee from University of Cambridge.
Hi, Adam.
Hi, Katrina.
Very nice to hear your talk. There's a lot of information. So I just want to first ask a question about the prosodic typology you mentioned. So you said Singaporean English relies more on the phrasal marking, the phrasal. So there are other languages that are also categorized as phrasing languages, like French or Korean. Like, how does Singaporean English similar or different from these phrasing languages?
Yeah, so I think the question here is the presence or absence of lexical prominence, right? So in a language like Korean, there is no, it's a phrasage-based language, or edge prominence language, right? But at least within the intonational model or understanding of lexical prosody in Korean, there is no lexical stress, right? So there is no marking because there is no stress, right? Lexical prominence. Similarly, and with French, right, these under one model, the sort of the main focus of accent, right, is sort of post-lexical level, right, and not at the lexical level, right. Now, this is different at least from, say, cases like, where is it? What's been argued for languages like Croat or Uyghur, where people have argued that actually there is some kind of lexical stress, but where F0 is just not used to mark at the sentence level, right? F0 is primarily used to mark just the edges, right? So it's essentially, you know, the sort of like the parameter plus minus lexical stress, right? And plus minus whether F0 is actually used to mark it, right? For the most part, languages with lexical stress, at least within the typology we have currently, seem to use F0 as well to mark those in some way, shape, or form, right? But there seem to be some sets of languages, again, like these here, that where that's not the case. Right. So sort of, I guess it's an in-between case because it has lexical prominence, but it doesn't seem to be using F0 consistently for that.
I see.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
I have a second question, like maybe a little bit beyond your topic, that like what is the implication for its focus marking if Singaporean English is primarily used compared to the standard British English?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Something we are hoping to answer with our production studies that were currently COVID halted. So I think there are a couple of things that can happen here. So you can imagine using focus marking that's not tied to a specific syllable, right, where it really targets an entire unit. So for example, perhaps, I mean, one, in sort of initial qualitative data that we looked at, actually when I looked at sort of in the initial set, when I put together the model, it looks as though what you get is potentially a higher pitch excursion across the entire phrase when the initial element of a sentence or the first AP is the focused constituent, right? So you kind of have like, it's something to do with alignment potentially, as well as just the pitch range, right? But not necessarily like a different pitch accent, right? Whether there are sort of minor details of it, like alignment to the stress level, we don't know because you would need more careful examination for that. But what I also found, again, this is incredibly preliminary, was that you do find that in non-initial position, that may not be the case, that perhaps things like lengthening might take over as the cue for focus, right? Because of the fact that your phonetic range of 0 is more limited, right? And so the sort of, that's kind of, but what we might expect is that really the entire constituent is being focused versus like a specific syllable, right? But that's part of the question we're trying to answer with kind of the the kind of ongoing investigation of focus. Do we sort of see specific syllables that are the locus of these F0 transitions, or is it really kind of a global pattern across a larger unit? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The last question will come from Satay Pata at University of Lille.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So it was a question that I was supposed to ask after, but since there are not that many questions, I ask it now. In Chong's model, I saw low boundary tone in the end of the IEP, and in the example you gave on the pitch track, I did not see anything like that. And when you play the sound, anything that looks like a final lowering. Is there anything like this in the language, or is it just an accident, this example?
It's a good question, Cedric. There is evidence for final lowering. So there are some people who definitely do it. Let me see. I'm just going to try and find you some data that sheds light on this. Let's see. I'm not sure you can, let me do this. So this is some data that we've got with, in the second set, the study I didn't really go into, and where we looked at essentially what's going on in non-initial phrases. And the answer to your question is yes, in some cases. So on the left hand here, we do see what's clearly, what we can at least posit as a low boundary tone in the same way that we can see in the top right panel here. But in many cases, what we also do see is this plateau type contour, right? Where it's kind of not, it is not lowering in what we expect, but then also where we have sort of plateau and then just a high degree of glottalization, which we can take to potentially be evidence of some kind of final lowering, right? So I guess, yeah, the answer is yes, but kind of not, depending on the context. We're trying to kind of figure out how to best interpret some of these, because at least it's been, I presented this a while ago in Singapore, and it's been argued that some production like this is not prototypical, which I would agree actually in some ways. And so how much of this is then, how much of this, you know, like where is this coming from? Right, so this is a part of the other murkiness of this variety. That makes sense. Yeah. So it's there. It's just not always there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's thank Adam one more time for the talk.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Let me wrap up the event before we continue brief discussion, if there's any left. I would like to thank two assistants, Yukki Baldoria Wu and Miyu Iizuka, as well as the Liaison Institute Assistant Michinori Suzuki. This event was supported by the shared budget of ICU Research Institute and Institute for Educational Research and Service and the Linguistic Lab at ICU. The next colloquium on prosody will be held on December 5th, 2 weeks from now. Emily Elfner from York University and Natalie Weber from Yale University will share the research. For European colleagues, it's not an ideal time. The talks will be held from 10 a.m. Japan Standard Time. We also have a phonetic talk series in collaboration with Keio University. Next Friday, 10 a.m. On November 27th, we will have two talks, Chikago Takahashi from Stony Brook University and Jianjing Kwang from University of Pennsylvania. You can find more information on titles and abstracts when you go to the website. Thank you all for participating in today's colloquium, and we hope to see you on November 27th or December 5th. The recording will now be stopped.